The largest predator to ever walk the earth was not T-Rex. It wasn't even close. What it was, and how it actually lived, took science over a century to figure out. And the reason it took that long is one of the stranger stories in the history of paleontology. In 1944, a British bombing raid struck Munich. A museum took a direct hit. And when the smoke cleared, the only known fossils of this animal, bones that had taken years to excavate from the Egyptian desert, shipped across a continent, studied for 3 decades, were gone. Destroyed in a single night by a war that had nothing to do with them. Science was left with drawings, measurements, and almost no physical evidence of an animal that had been, by every indication, unlike anything that had ever lived. What we've recovered since then, from riverbeds and rock faces in Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt, has rewritten the story 3 separate times, and it still isn't finished. This is Spinosaurus. Start with the size, because the size matters. Current estimates based on partial skeletons and comparative bone analysis place Spinosaurus between 46 and 59 feet in length. Tyrannosaurus rex averaged around 40 feet. The largest T-Rex ever found, the specimen known as Sue, now in Chicago's Field Museum, measured just over 40 feet. Spinosaurus, at conservative estimates, was longer. At the higher end of current projections, it wasn't close. But length alone doesn't capture what made this animal strange. What made it strange was everything else. Running along its back was a structure that has no real equivalent in any predatory animal alive today. A row of elongated neural spines, some reaching over 5 feet in height, forming a sail or possibly a muscular hump along the spine. The function of that structure is still debated. Early researchers assumed thermoregulation, a large surface area to absorb or release heat, the way a solar panel works. More recent hypotheses point toward display, the way elaborate ornamentation functions in modern birds. Others argue the spine supported dense muscle rather than a thin skin sail, making it a hump closer to a bison's than a fin's. The fossil record doesn't resolve the question, because soft tissue doesn't preserve. What Spinosaurus looked like from the outside, the actual silhouette of the living animal, is still partly a guess. What isn't a guess is what the skeleton shows about how this animal lived. And here is where the story takes its first major turn. The legs are short relative to the body. The hind limbs are proportionally small in a way that would have made efficient bipedal movement on land difficult to sustain over distance. The feet show evidence of dense, heavy bone, a feature seen in modern diving birds like loons and grebes, where it functions as ballast, counteracting buoyancy and allowing the animal to stay submerged without constant effort. The nostrils sit high on the skull, positioned well back from the tip of the snout, the same arrangement found in crocodilians that spend most of their time in water and need to breathe without fully surfacing. The skull itself is long and narrow, with conical interlocking teeth that are built not for tearing flesh, but for gripping slippery prey. Every one of those features points in the same direction. Spinosaurus was built for water. Not occasionally, structurally, fundamentally built for it. And that was not what anyone expected from the largest predatory dinosaur ever found. 95 million years ago, what is now the Sahara Desert was a vast river system draining toward a shallow inland sea. The Kim beds of Morocco and Algeria preserve the remains of that ecosystem, and what lived there was unlike almost any environment in the fossil record before or since. Carcharodontosaurus, a large theropod comparable in overall size to T-Rex, hunted along the banks. Crocodilians exceeding 30 feet in length occupied the waterways. Enormous sawfish, their rostra nearly 10 feet long, moved through the current alongside giant coelacanths and lungfish that dwarfed anything in today's rivers. Spinosaurus lived in the middle of this. The direct evidence for what it ate comes from the teeth. Shed Spinosaurus teeth have been recovered in direct association with fish remains at multiple sites across North Africa, which establishes dietary overlap, but not much more. More specific is a specimen in which fish scales were found preserved within the rib cage, in the anatomical position where stomach contents would have settled after death. The scales belong to Mawsonia, a genus of giant coelacanth that reached lengths of around 10 feet in the Cretaceous period. Spinosaurus was eating large fish that were themselves substantial animals, and the context of the find indicates it was doing so in the water rather than catching them from the bank. A 2020 study took this further. Researchers examined the oxygen isotope ratios preserved in Spinosaurus teeth and compared them to other animals from the same formation. Isotope ratios in teeth reflect the water an animal drinks and the environment it inhabits during the years those teeth are forming. The Spinosaurus ratios matched the aquatic fauna, turtles, crocodilians, fish, consistently and significantly more closely than they matched the terrestrial dinosaurs from the same sites. The chemical record preserved in 95-million-year-old enamel places Spinosaurus in the water, not beside it. How it moved through that water became clearer in 2020 when a detailed description of the Spinosaurus tail was published, based on a specimen recovered from the Kem beds in Morocco. The tail vertebrae carried tall, flexible neural spines, forming a fin-like structure. Biomechanical modeling of that tail showed it was capable of generating meaningful thrust through lateral undulation, the same movement pattern used by crocodilians and many species of fish. The conclusion the researchers drew was careful but significant. Spinosaurus could swim, with a tail that appeared specifically adapted for aquatic propulsion. Not wading, not paddling with its limbs. Swimming! When Spinosaurus appeared in Jurassic Park 3 in 2001, upright, fast, killing a T-Rex within the first 10 minutes, it reflected the best available science at the time. That science reconstructed Spinosaurus as a large terrestrial theropod, unusual for its scale, but otherwise built and behaved roughly like other large predatory dinosaurs. It was a reasonable interpretation of fragmentary evidence. It was also wrong in almost every important respect. And the process of discovering how wrong it was has unfolded across 3 decades of increasingly contentious research. The first major revision came in 2014. Paleontologist Nizar Ibrahim and a team from the University of Chicago published a paper in the journal Science describing a partial Spinosaurus skeleton from the Kem beds. The specimen included hind limb material that hadn't been available before, and what those limbs showed was unambiguous. Short, dense, built for an animal that spent significant time in water. The team's reconstruction placed Spinosaurus as semi-aquatic, capable of moving on land, but clearly and primarily adapted for life in and around rivers. The paper was accompanied by a full skeletal reconstruction and a life restoration that looked nothing like the animal anyone had pictured for the previous century. The response from other researchers was not uniformly positive. The hind limb material used in Ibrahim's reconstruction came from multiple individuals, different animals, possibly of different ages, assembled into a composite. And critics argued that this introduced proportional errors that skewed the reconstruction toward shorter legs than a single individual might actually show. The debate in the literature became pointed. Papers were published in direct response to other papers. The question of whether Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic, primarily aquatic, or something more ambiguous became genuinely contested in a way that rarely happens with extinct animals. Then the 2020 tail study added pressure in the other direction. If the tail was adapted for aquatic propulsion, the semi-aquatic model was arguably still too conservative. A 2022 biomechanical analysis attempted to model Spinosaurus locomotion across both environments and concluded that it was poorly suited to sustained movement on land, but reasonably efficient in water, placing it ecologically closer to a large crocodilian than to any other dinosaur in the fossil record. 3 revisions in 30 years, each one built on new physical evidence, each one making the previous version look like an understandable mistake given what was known at the time. What's unusual isn't that the science changed. Paleontology revises constantly as new material surfaces. What's unusual is the magnitude of the revision and the fact that each version has moved Spinosaurus further from anything we have a living analog for. There is no modern animal that fully maps onto what Spinosaurus appears to have been. Every comparison is partial. Every model is an approximation. There is still no complete Spinosaurus skeleton anywhere in the world. What exists is a collection of partial specimens from different individuals, excavated from different sites across decades, assembled into reconstructions that continue to be revised as new material surfaces. The most complete specimen ever found, the one Ernst Stromer shipped from Egypt to Munich in the early 20th century, was destroyed in 1944. Stromer himself died in 1952, aware that the physical evidence for his most significant work no longer existed. He had asked the museum director to move the fossils before the bombing and been refused. He spent his final years working from his own drawings. The sites where Spinosaurus material continues to surface are difficult to access and politically complicated to work. The Kim beds erode continuously, and fossils that reach the surface are frequently collected through the commercial fossil trade before scientists can document them in stratigraphic context, meaning the information about where exactly in the rock a specimen was found, which is often as scientifically valuable as the fossil itself, is lost before anyone with a research background sees it. Material that could resolve the remaining questions about how this animal was proportioned, how it moved, how it reproduced, may already be in private collections that researchers have no access to. What the available evidence supports is this. Spinosaurus was real, it was large beyond easy comparison, and it occupied an ecological role that no other large dinosaur is known to have filled. It lived in one of the most dangerous environments in the fossil record and apparently thrived there for millions of years. When the Cretaceous ended, it went with everything else. What we don't know is still most of the story. The proportions of a complete individual, the full range of its behavior. Whether the sail was display or thermoregulation or something else entirely. How it interacted with the other apex predators sharing its river system. What its growth stages looked like. Whether the aquatic adaptations visible in the skeleton translate directly into the behavior the biomechanical models suggest, or whether living animals find ways to confound what their bones seem to predict. The fossils are still out there, eroding out of cliff faces in Morocco, washing into dry riverbeds in Algeria, sitting in Egyptian sand the way they sat for 95 million years before anyone thought to look. Some of them will surface in the next decade. Some won't surface for centuries. Some will be found by scientists who will publish what they mean. Others will disappear into private collections before anyone can study them. The animal that Stromer found in 1912 is still, more than 100 years later, mostly missing. Whether what remains of it stays in the ground long enough to be found is not a question paleontology can answer.